Tyler. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for a race equity training. As you are likely aware, race equity in the provision of homeless services is one of the priorities of HUD. HUD is the federal funder of our continuum of care and many of our homeless outreach work across our region. Today, we are very fortunate to be joined by several colleagues from Racial Equity Partners, both Donald Whitehead and Maite Antello Ovando. I'm going to hand it off to them for today's training. And again, we really thank you for your participation and being a part of this conversation today. Donald?
Thank you, Kelly, and we thank all of you. It's a really an honor and a pleasure to be with you again. Racial Equity Partners and MAG have been joined together for over 3 years now. In fact, you are our first client, so we're always happy and appreciative to be with you. Today is one of our newer presentations that we share with the community, and we'll get into a little bit more about what will happen today. With me today is Maite Antello Ovando. She's going to introduce herself in just a second, just a little bit more about Racial Equity Partners, our rep. We have been around since 2020. Jeff Olivet, who is the current director of the U.S. Interagency Council, and I work with the community even before we started to form REP. And again, just really, really grateful to be here. We've been working since then throughout the country with for-profit, nonprofit, some local community organizations, and even faith-based organizations, really, as our country has started to have more conversations about race, racial equity, and DEI, we have been able to share our learnings throughout our careers about it. And I'll just introduce myself. I've been working on both racial equity and homeless issues for the better part of 28 years, and have worked in every level of homeless service delivery, from outreach to executive director positions. I'm currently also the executive director of the National Coalition for the Homeless. And again, it's been an honor and a pleasure to work with the MAG, the Maricopa Association of Governments. I call them MAG because we've I think developed a great relationship over the time. I know many of you do that as well. But we have been really happy to work alongside you for that time now. Jeff Olivet, as I said, left to be the Interagency Council Director. And since then, REP has grown and brought on some just amazing facilitators who've been doing the work for quite a bit of time themselves. And I want to introduce my co-presenter today, Maite Antello Ovando.
Thank you so much, Donald. I'm hoping everyone can hear me. If not, please let me know. So I am coming to you today from Providence, Rhode Island, and I am a Racial Equity Partners associate and have been working with Donald and Kavita, who's the other co-founder in addition to Jeff, for probably 1.5 years, maybe a little bit longer. I am also a practicing bilingual and English and Spanish school psychologist and a sort of independent consulting doing clinical trainings as well, in addition to the equity work that I'm very happy to do alongside Donald, Kavita, and Jeff for some time. So we're going to walk you through a little bit of an overview, which I'm going to let Donald start with. But before we do that, we're also going to walk you through something that we'll do this first. So I'll go ahead and do this. So today, as Donald said, we're going to go through something that's a little bit newer in our sort of repertoire, which really is just a session about grounding in what is race, what is racism, what is whiteness, and how do we spot what we call detours, which Donald is going to walk us through as we go through this training. And really what we want to do is develop an understanding of race, learn more again about whiteness, white supremacy, white privilege, and discuss challenges that might arise and ways that we can, again, sort of address the racist undercurrents that exist, especially connected to the, as we've said, the work of ending homelessness. Another thing that I will say about myself is I was a former director of clinical services at an agency in Boston working to end family and individual homelessness. So these conversations are always close to my heart. So I'm very happy to be here with y'all to do this today. So One of the things that Donald, myself, Kavita, and all the facilitators do when we're having these discussions with people is to make sure that we go through some guidelines. And so what you see in front of you, hopefully, on a screen is these sort of bullet points that we try to go through together so that we are grounded in what is today's session going to be and what is it going to require of you. So guidelines are, the first one is to expect to experience some discomfort. Many wise people have said that there is great learning to be had in discomfort. Simply what that means is that we might be going through something that we've never experienced before. You might be hearing things that you've never heard before and or understand things in a different way. And sometimes that can create a level of discomfort. The other thing that I would say is to just pay attention to your reactions to how you're feeling and to your body and to what you need. It might be that there are moments where you need to take a break. Maybe you walk away from your computer, you get a glass of water, whatever it is. So basically just here wanting to remind you that there might be some discomfort experienced given our topics, and just please take care of yourselves as that happens. The other thing that we ask of you all is to stay as engaged as possible. We know that this is, the virtual world, and there are many distractions that can be happening, and you all are very busy and important people. And we understand that sometimes distractions are inevitable, but if there are things that you can do to stay as engaged as possible, that would be fantastic. We'd also like you to speak your truth. What we really mean by this is when you're sharing your thoughts or experiences, make sure that you're doing it from your experience. So use I statements, share about yourself. We're not expecting anybody to speak for other people or for other groups of people. And again, we also want to respect people's truths, people's experiences. We also make sure to say that it's important to expect and accept what we call non-closure, which basically just points to the fact that, we are talking about racism today and its impact and how we can make change individually and as a whole. And it doesn't mean that, unfortunately, we're going to solve the problems today, right? We're starting a conversation, we're sharing space together to learn. And that means that we're going to be in a learning process together, but there is going to be no closure at the end in that way. And then lastly, we talk about suspending judgment. And as a psychologist, what I like to say when we talk about this is to judge is to be human. So I'm not saying that you're going to suppress all judgments. What we are saying in this guideline is you might notice a judgment, you might notice that you're making an assumption, and the ask here is to notice it and pause around it, and then ask a question. Sort of ask yourself, why am I thinking this? Why am I making an assumption around this? Interesting. So just be curious and notice the judgments when they occur. Donald, anything to add to this before I move us along?
No, I think you did a great job explaining.
Okay. Great. So I'll just hand it over to you.
So we want to first start out by just saying that we know that having a discussion about race can be difficult. That's why we certainly ask you to follow those guidelines. And just as a little bit of a housekeeping issue, we are hoping to be as inclusive and have you involved in the conversation to the extent possible. We will have some discussion space, and although we're in a webinar format, we have you still have the opportunity to join us. So if you would raise your hand if you want to be called on, we'll make you a panelist, and you'll be able to share in the discussion. So please remember that when we get to the point where discussions happen. But we want to first start out by just saying that we definitely understand that conversations about race can be very difficult, particularly within groups of white people or people that are mixed race. And this often results in detours or deflections away from the topic of race. We believe, though, in order to understand why this happens and get to a point where we can normalize discussions about race, we first have to understand what race is and race isn't. And a quote here from Ta-Nehisi Coates says, Americans believe in the reality of race as a defined, indisputable feature of our natural world. Racism, the need to ascribe bone-deep features to people and then humiliate, reduce, and destroy them, inevitably follows from this inalterable condition. In the ways racism is rendered as the innocent daughter of Mother Nature, and one is left to deplore the Middle Passage or the Trail of Tears the way one deplores an earthquake, a tornado or any other phenomenon that can be cast as beyond the handiwork of man. But race is the child of racism and not the father. Really important point to understand. Race is a social construct, which means that there is no biological reason for us to be separated by race. We are all the same biologically. And the reason race was created, and if we start in America, we start in the late 1600s. But if we go further back, race was used as an excuse to colonize countries. It was first introduced as a excuse for pillaging countries for those that consider themselves either Christian or religious in nature. So in order to justify going into countries and stealing both goods and enslaving individuals, the idea of a race was created. So one group of people, Europeans, were considered supreme to other groups of people. And the idea of race became something that was used in the Age of Enlightenment. And we could go through that. We're not going to stay that far back. We're going to fast forward a little bit when we talk about this. And again, it's a social construct, which means it has no genetic basis. It evolved with freedom, granting privilege based on skin color, and justified social inequality and oppression of certain groups. Again, it was a way that people who were considered good people or Christians or religious people were able to justify what they were doing in countries across the world where people were being enslaved and colonized. Going to fast forward to the United States. Even before we get to the census, one of the ways that race was really defined in this country happened after, and we don't get all of history, but one piece of history that a lot of us may have learned about is the Bacon Rebellion. And it's a really important landmark in our history when we understand race, racism, and supremacy. So the Bacon Rebellion was a rebellion that happened in colonial Virginia, where the principal actor, a man by the name of Bacon, brought together indentured white servants and indentured servants of color, mainly African-American indentured servants, and they created an uprising. It frightened the settlers of that time. And in order to quell that rebellion and also find a way to separate indentured white servants and indentured African servants, they decided to come up with something called slave codes and black codes. And at that time, moving forward in our history, African slaves were slaves for life. They were born into slavery, and it granted colonists at the time a lot of really egregious and painful privileges, so they could exact any kind of penalty on the bodies of African slaves after that point. So it was used as a divisive measure. And we know that even today, in the Civil War, in many of our conversations today, it's still used that way. So it really dates back to that time around the late 1600s that we really kind of enshrined the slavery of African Americans and dehumanized them in our country. That had already been done again way back in the 1400s, but really became apparent, and we'll kind of move from that point in our journey here. So in 1790, around the beginning of the census, there were two racial categories: free or slave. Census takers determined race. Specific rules limited who was counted as white, and you'll see through that and through that long period of history, there was challenges by other groups of people, Asian Americans. There were also challenges by Middle Eastern Americans to be considered white. because their skin was close to white, but the census still determined that it was very limited. Both of those cases, the Asian American and also the American from the Middle East, both lost those Supreme Court cases to be considered white. So white was very limited, and it did not involve even people that were very close in skin color. They were defeated by the census. Now I'll keep going on the census. From 1980 to 1990, if a person marked more than one race category, the Bureau recategorized that person as a single race. So mixed race individuals were not considered, they were deemed to be of one race. And people first asked if they were of Spanish, people were first asked if they were of Hispanic or Spanish origin right around the 1980s and 1990s. In 2010, people were able to identify more than one race as a category. This is 2010 when we got to the point where we started to really expand the definition of race. In 2015, of the 42.7 million adults in the United States with Hispanic ancestry, it's estimated that 5 million said they do not identify as Hispanic or Latino. So very important, and even deeper than that in Puerto Rico, for instance, while a majority of the population has an African descent, most of, I think about 90% of those individuals did not identify as having African origins. So race is really again, it's a social construct. It has no basis, and that's why it's so hard to identify, particularly in homelessness. When we start to categorize people, you'll find many challenges. And so this is kind of an overview of where we got to when it comes to race. There's a lot of history in between what I just described, but I really want to make the point that we categorize people by race as a way of defining people as less important, less worthy, and that has unfortunately transcended through our history from the 1400s to now, but it is a social construct. There is no biological difference or genetic difference when it comes to race. So we're going to go to a video that talks about this a little bit more. This video is an MTV video. We use. Have you ever wondered? Francisco Ramsey is the person who's on this video.
Oh no. Let's see. Slight technical difficulties because
I wonder if you back out and come back in. There we
go. Oh. Yeah, no, it's still not. It's still not loading. Let's give it 1 second. Sorry, you all. There we go.
Have you ever wondered why people say, oh, I don't see color as a way to fix racism? Yeah, that doesn't work. On this show, we talk about race all the time, but I've got a bomb to drop. Biologically speaking, race doesn't exist. Oh my goodness. Why am I hosting this show? So race isn't biological, but the social construct of race and racism still have a very real impact on everyone's lives. And this isn't just about feelings. Race is all about the structural foundation of social power. So why do so many people incorrectly think race is biological? Well, beyond the fact that we like to group people based on external characteristics, it goes like this. In biology, there is a concept of genetically different subspecies, which a lot of people confuse with human races. Biologists actually have a scale for this, and humans don't even come close to qualifying. Throughout history, people have used this incorrect understanding of subspecies to justify all kinds of terribleness, and even proclaim other races as less than human. But modern genetics has shown that the lines around race are so arbitrary that they're actually meaningless. And since I'm not a scientist, I'll take a quote. Francis Collins, the director of the National Human Genome Research Institute, said it himself: those who wish to draw precise racial boundaries around certain groups will not be able to use science as a legitimate justification. Oops, I dropped the mic. So if race doesn't exist biologically, why do we keep talking about it? Sound the alarm. We keep talking about race because we created it. Us. That's right. Race is a social construct. A social construct is a category, perception, or idea created and developed by society and then applied to individuals or groups. But social constructs are still very real and have huge impacts on our lives. Because you know what else is a social construct? Money. And if you don't think money has an enormous impact on your life, well, then congratulations. You either have a trust fund or you're an adorable baby, or maybe you're a dog. Here's what I know. Talking about racism just creates more racism. No. First off, race isn't the problem. Racism is. And even if it was the problem, problems don't get worse when you talk about them, and they don't magically go away when you ignore them. Not true. I had 5 cavities. I ignored them, and all 5 of those teeth fell out. Poof. Problem solved. Color blindness, while nice in theory, has no effect on structural and institutional racism. Racism is a system, and that system benefits certain people at the expense of others. Ignoring it just lets those problems persist. Don't believe me? Let's take a look at some examples where color blindness doesn't work. Number 1, preschool punishment. Let's face a fact. Preschool-aged children of every race are monsters. But according to the U.S. Department of Education Office for Civil Rights report released in 2014, Black children make up 18% of preschoolers, but almost half of all suspensions. Half. And I don't think anybody believes all these preschool teachers are racist out to get little Black children, but the data shows that Black and Latino children often face steeper punishments than their white classmates for the same behavior. That's a problem. And simply believing we shouldn't see race or we shouldn't talk about race does nothing to solve this problem. Number 2, the name study. A study by the National Bureau of Economic Research confirmed that people with ethnic sounding names, that's a whole nother episode, are less likely to get interviewed when they apply for jobs. Meanwhile, applicants with white sounding names actually get 33% more callbacks for interviews. It's the equivalent of having 8 years of additional experience. Shout out to all the white Taquans struggling to get job interviews. And it's not just Black and white. They've done similar studies around the world, and in Canada, people with white sounding names were 35% more likely to get callbacks than people with Indian or Chinese sounding names. So instead of just assuming people shouldn't care about color or names, companies, governments, and schools should take the bias out of hiring and experiment with nameless resumes to, solve the problem. Number 3, renting an apartment. When the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Urban Institute did a study about real estate, they found that Black, Latino, and Asian renters were shown up to 12% fewer units than white renters. And when the Fair Housing Justice Center used actors to apply for apartments, they found that Black and Latino renters were often told there were no apartments available, while white applicants were shown apartments in the same building. So this building has a pool, a laundry room, and a racist landlady. Colorblindness won't fix housing discrimination. We're going to need smart laws and a concerted effort for that. So tell me again how colorblindness is going to fix the fact that I can't get an education, a job, or a house. In many cases, colorblindness is actively harmful because it creates a false sense of security for the groups it directly benefits. The people who benefited from systemic racism can assume that they got the job or a house or weren't suspended from preschool simply because they were more qualified or just better. Ignoring race or only acknowledging that it doesn't exist biologically is not a solution to these systemic issues. It takes work, effort, laws, and new systems to undo racism. These differences may seem minute, but they're part of a very large structure of oppression that's been ingrained in us. If we can understand that we made it up, we can actively work to change it. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time right here on Decoded.
Okay, let's see if I can get you all back to where we were. One moment.
And we love those videos. They really kind of break things down in a way that really relates to our everyday lives. And sometimes it's a lot easier for us to see these really complex issues in that kind of way.
And actually, while I get us back on to the slide presentation, what we wanted to do here is ask you all a question after having seen this video. So I'm going to type it in the chat. But the question is, when did you first learn that race wasn't biological? So if you could, and again, as Donald said, if there's something that you'd like to share, please raise your hand, but you can also type in the chat. And once you realize that it wasn't college, thank you, Vanessa. And once you realize that it wasn't, did it change the way that you look at our society? I'm gonna type that in. Did it change?
And Vanessa, did you want to kind of expand on your answer? And I also see Donna says college. So college was a place where a lot of people learn. I'm sorry, go ahead. So we have some schools that were a lot more advanced because a few of you learned in high school. And we're going to talk a little bit about later on. I don't think we really pointed that out about kind of one of the biggest detours that we see in our society right now that is gaining steam. But Vanessa, did you want to share?
Oh, sure. I was just gonna to elaborate. It was, if I remember correctly, it was a class specifically on a sociology. So, it wasn't even a general class. I think you had to really be interested in this topic to learn about that.
Yeah, and as we'll explore a little bit later, it's actually unfortunately becoming even harder to do that.
Mhm.
So we see more responses in the chat. Rachel says 10 years ago, and in high school was a couple of other responses. Also want to just go back really quickly to the key points in this particular part of our discussion. And Kathleen said, anybody, I see a lot of high school and college. Anybody learn this in elementary school?
Mm.
All right. So we have a couple of people. And Megan, I really love that response because what we learn about race is from our socialization, which happens first of all with those that we love and learn from. So our parents are really our first teachers about race, along with our classmates, schoolmates, and friends. And then, unfortunately, more of that is being taught by video lesson and by social media these days. But that socialization really starts early. And I think one of the things we will talk about as we move forward is just, how we do a better job of that ourselves with our parents and with our children and with our other loved ones, how we can start that socialization earlier, more often, and really make these conversations things that are very natural. So the key points in what we just went over is one, race is a social construct. The impact of race is real. Our racial identity shapes who we are in the world and how we experience it. And we can all use our racial identity as a place of strength to create change. So those are four very important things that we have pulled out from our discussion, and would love to hear any more of your comments in the chat. College, I had an interest in science, biology, and chemistry, and it did change my views. So Maite, you want to jump back into the question?
Sure. So, and I apologize, I'm having a technical difficulty. So this is what y'all are going to be able to see because we have a couple other videos that we're going to show you. So I'm just going to leave it as is. So as Donald said, it is really important to sort of pause and consider these questions and to recognize that race is a social construct and that we are living and breathing in a racist society. And so one of the things that we said at the very beginning that we were going to do with you all was also discuss whiteness and understanding what whiteness is. So I'm going to walk us through that before we go into more conversation about detours. So what is white supremacy? How might we define it? So there are going to be, like many things in this work, there are many different ways of defining these terms, but what we use in this training is the following definition. So white supremacy is the belief that the white race is inherently superior, which Donald said earlier today, to other races, and that white people should have control over people of other races. So for example, one could say, as this definition includes, the alt-right is a reactionary conservative movement. It's It's characterized by an embrace of fascism, white supremacy, and misogyny, according to Constance Grady, right? Another way of thinking about what white supremacy is it's the social, economic, and political systems that collectively enable white people to maintain power over people of other races. And what I really want to highlight here is the use of the word power. So when we're talking about race and racism, what we really are talking about, which we might have said already, is that racism inherently is about a group of people holding power over another group of people. And in this case, it's white identified and or white facing, perhaps even are white people or white supremacy aligned people are the ones that are holding power over another group of people, in this case, people of color, right? Another way of thinking about this is, even if that is not the intention, the society within which we live, again, is couched in racist policies and laws that still, on the one hand, benefit one group over benefiting another. But again, it's another way of thinking about power. And as this definition states, which I'll restate just to make sure that it's landing, is this: white supremacy is the social, economic, and political system that collectively enables white people to maintain power over other races, right? So another thing that we wanted to make sure that we highlighted here, along with, again, this idea of understanding what whiteness is. And one of the things that we also talk about a lot when we are preparing for these training sessions is that this is not about placing blame. This is about understanding concepts and understanding that, again, we are living and working in a society that has, unfortunately, been created on top of racist policies that have led to inequities, right? And so another thing that comes to mind when we're talking about understanding whiteness is white privilege. So how does one define white privilege? White privilege is unearned advantage based on race, which can be observed both systematically and individually. And really what that is saying is someone can be experiencing white privilege as an individual, and you're going to see this sort of come to light even more when we go through the Detour's discussion about what does that look like and what is a privilege that someone might carry that is white or white facing versus someone that is not. And so again, it's a benefit based on your individual person, but it's also an advantage that can be systematic or can be experienced as a collective. So it's not just an individual advantage, it can also be a collective advantage. Let me see. So again, here's some examples, as I mentioned before. So what does white privilege look like? White privilege could be, for example, walking around in a, I was about to say fancy. No, it doesn't have to be fancy, but in a store and not being harassed or followed when you're shopping, because the inherent assumption, perhaps when someone that is a person of color or someone that is being seen as a person of color in a store, is that they might be followed. And that is generally not the experience that somebody that is white or white facing experiences. Another example here of white privilege might be where we are taught that white people made civilization what it is. Another way of thinking about that is that there is a white normative or white centrist way of thinking about the world. Another example is suffer no penalty for ignorance of language and customs of people who comprise the majority of the world's population. Really what this is saying is that white privilege can be that it's okay if somebody doesn't understand someone else's language, or there's no expectation for someone that is, again, a part of the white majority to seek to understand another language that is not English, for example. As you see in the quote here, quote, "I was taught to see racism only in individual acts of meanness, not in invisible systems conferring dominance on any group," right? Or conferring dominance on my group. And in this case, the group being white. Now, another thing we highlight here, which I actually just finished rereading today in preparation, is this book, White Fragility. And so in the book, White Fragility, written by Robin DiAngelo, who is a diversity, equity, and inclusion educator, the book states, "White fragility is a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves." And then in another book called Me and White Supremacy, there's a quote that states, "In essence, white fragility looks like a white person taking the position of victim when it is in fact the white person who has committed or participated in acts of racial harm." So again, the point being made here is, how do we understand whiteness, or what does it mean? Part of understanding whiteness, in addition to understanding what white supremacy is and what power is understanding this concept of white fragility, which is, again, this idea that if you are identifying as white or seen as white, that there is this idea that there is an exemption there, that you don't have to understand what race is, or you don't have to understand what racism is, partly because there is a privilege and not being impacted by race. But it's also about understanding that white is a racial identity. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you a video that illustrates a lot of this conversation. And so if you all will humor me, I'm going to stop this share and get you all to the video. And I don't know if I missed anything in the chat, so if you want to look at that while I'm setting this up. Let's see.
Most of the chat is from our previous conversation.
Just want to make sure I'm not missing anything. Let's go to conversation on race. So let me share my screen. And hopefully you all can see this.
Yes.
Okay, great. Let me just press play. Sound good?
No.
Could you scroll up, please?
Sure.
The video's kind of cut off. Thank you.
There we go. Thank you.
It's very uncomfortable to talk about race. It's not something I do. I am feeling apprehensive because I think there's a lot of reasons why I feel like I should be able to talk about race.
I don't want to say anything, that would offend anyone. It's a very touchy subject. It's still difficult, even if you feel like you're on the right side of it, to have a dialogue about it.
Especially for white people, because we don't want to see if the racism that we may be holding on to.
I don't know. Maybe I am racist. I certainly don't like to think that I am. And I think that's too because the perception in this society, perception of a racist is a guy in a robe.
Now I understand that it's a system of advantages and disadvantages based on race. So as much as there's the disadvantage piece of it, there's the advantage piece of it, which is what I experience as a white person.
I want to bring up race, and I want to bring it up in a frame that helps my children think that there's no difference. But the mere fact that I might be bringing it up could suggest that there is a difference.
I remember asking a friend of my father's who's Black why he was called Black, because his skin was brown. And I've learned that lots of people that are white ask this question, and maybe they also received the answer that I got from my parents, which was like, oh my gosh, we're so sorry that she asked that, and it's just a term, like, move on.
One of my third grade students seemed pretty rocked after the Eric Garner case or death, and came up to me and said, why, when you were little, like, were you worried about this stuff too? And I knew what he was talking about before. I mean, I didn't say, what do you mean, what stuff? I didn't want to, play dumb. And I said, no, like, I didn't have to be, and that's not fair. And that was really hard because he just kind of sat there, and it honestly seemed like the first time that he had considered the fact that not everyone had to think about race all the time.
I know that I'm white, and I guess I'm part of that collection. But I don't think about being white. I don't.
I really did not know that I had a racial identity. I knew I was white. I had no idea what that meant, how that had shaped my outlook on life, how that had shaped my sense of optimism, sense of belonging, sense of safety, sense of feeling entitled to go help children that I thought were part of a community that couldn't figure out how to help themselves.
I think that impulse, that kind of colorblindness impulse, comes mostly from white people. Like, I've never heard, I mean, I don't know. I'm sure it comes from all people of all kinds, but I've heard it most from white people who are saying, like, let's do this as a way of getting past this racism thing. And I think in part it comes from a sense of shame and guilt about what racism has done, and kind of how racism was built by white people.
I don't want to be ashamed of being, and plus I'm a male. It's like every group out there can be pissed off at me because I'm white and a male. And that's a weird kind of burden that some people do feel. And I certainly feel it sometimes from people that I'm privileged. I get stuff that other people don't get.
I think we're all implicated in a racist system, and I play my part in it as a white person. So I do have individual responsibility and accountability. I mean, I'm part of the system, and I do things that both perpetuate it, and I try to certainly do things that challenge it.
I realize I've never said anything. When I've heard racist jokes, when I've heard racist comments, I've never said anything. I've never spoken up and said, hey, that's racist. Not once.
In my mind, I'm not involved in any conflict that involves race. I've only been the beneficiary of it. So to talk about it is I don't think I would sound very wise.
Being white means that I have the privilege to think that I'm not affected by racism. Or that I don't even have a race, because I have all these other things like a gender and a sexual orientation, and those are pretty neat. So I don't have a race, but I do, and I'm white.
Is that pretty well? And we're going to do the same thing that we did a second ago, and I'm going to type in a question that we'd love you to answer. So just give me a moment. So the question this time is, which you will see in 1 second, is what examples of privilege have you experienced in your own life or observed around you? What would you say to that question? Rachel, raise your hand. Let's see if we can give you the ability to be a panelist so we can hear you.
And Yurette says that when I first experienced a difference was as a child. There's some really interesting studies about just how early that impacts people. There's a Dahl study that really examines, and we could go more into it, but really fascinating stuff. But I see that we have Rachel on the panelist screen. Rachel, you want to go ahead?
I'm here. Thank you. I hope you can hear me.
We can hear you.
Oh, perfect. So that's a great question. There's so many times in my life where I've recognized that I've received white privilege. Many times. But what strikes me about thinking about race, generally speaking, is the changes that I have noticed throughout my life, which is from young age of thinking about, oh, better to be colorblind, to changing to now embracing people and knowing them in their own space and not having to pretend to not see color. I'm blind, and I'm legally blind, and even in the blindness community, we're all still raised by parents and our communities, and racism is still, prevalent there, just like any other community. And I find that surprises a lot of people. Which, you think, oh, well, now you have a disability, and so you're going to be super nice to everyone. And I still like, I'm a person who, even in my mind, I learned about the term passive racism in college, and I still in my mind will hear a voice and think, oh, are they Black? Are they white? Like I'm still doing that. And then I think, why am I thinking that? Why does that matter to me? That the first thing I want to do is put them in that box. Wow. Yeah. So, but I wouldn't have really thought about racism, generally speaking, or wouldn't have been able to really process out like how I feel about racism and things like that as a kid, because in my household, even though we had quite a multicultural family, my dad in particular, he often made a lot of comments about other races, and not in terms of what he could or could not do, but in terms of blaming them for things that we lacked, instead of looking at his own self, so
Mhm.
until I left that environment, I couldn't really, when you're a kid, you want to believe everything your parents say in some ways, yeah. So as an adult, it's been a fun journey though. Ta-Nehisi Coates is very enlightening.
Yeah.
So I've really enjoyed having an open heart instead of just being closed to all of these things, and feeling
Mm.
uncomfortable is a good thing.
Yes, yes. I just want you to
Thank
know
you
that
so
we
much.
are both Donald and I are nodding in the screen, and I recognize that we should be telling you that. So thank you. Thank you for your comments and I love what you said at the end about sort of the journey that you've gone on and having an open heart in order to take in this information and to take in the realization that, oh, wait, why am I thinking these things? Why am I asking these questions? Like you said, what do I need to know? Who's speaking to me and how they might identify. It's such an interesting take. So thank you so much for sharing. And again, recognizing that you said a second ago, we are born into the families that we are born into. We don't make those choices. And we are also born into this inherently racist system in society. And what we're trying to do here is allow for conversation that reminds us that there is something that we have agency over, which is our own reactions, our own behavior, and how that impacts the collective, right? So it impacts the collective and the place where we might work, in our families, in our social circles. And so again, a lot of this discussion really is about, as you said, Rachel, recognizing our reactions, recognizing what we're bringing into, our learnings and how we've been raised or what we've seen, what we've experienced, and then also being able to challenge and learn in discomfort, because as you said too, again, discomfort is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. And it's also passing. I think that's another thing that people forget sometimes. Of course, discomfort is something that we don't want to feel. And I think that sometimes when it's happening, it feels endless, but at the end of it, really, it is going to be, it's going to pass and we're going to survive through that. And there's learning happening in that space.
I wanted to, a lot of really good things in the chat. One particular one is about the human genome study, and that was by Christian. And then a lot of what we're hearing in the chat is about specific incidents. I recall a class in which I had to interview someone opposite of how I identify and discuss assumptions and privileges. And I think another important point that we hope everyone takes away, that there's a difference between prejudice and racism. And Maite highlighted it, the difference there, and it's with all the isms. It's not just racism, it's intersectionality, intersectional issues as well. Power is the dynamic that separates it. So, and we'll talk about that a little bit in detour spotting, but the concept of power, you have to have the ability to impact people's lives by being in that power position. And we're talking about it as a system versus an individual. So this isn't individuals. And the last thing I'll say, when we talk about whiteness, we also want people to understand, and privilege, we want people to understand that we understand that everybody has had challenges and barriers in their life. Everybody has had to go through things. The difference here, when we talk about privilege, whiteness, and racism, is that those difficulties and barriers were not as a result of your skin color. So that is a very distinct difference that we always want to impress upon people, that we understand everybody has had challenges, but not because of race, unless you're a person of color. So again, a lot of really good things in the chat. When I was in the 7th grade, we were bused across down to a predominantly white school. In math, I'd always gotten an A. I was getting an A up until the end of the year. I wound up getting a B when asked the teacher, he didn't give me an explanation. I walked back to my desk upset. When a person made a racial slur, we got into a disagreement and I wound up getting suspended. Now that's a lot to unpack. That's a very traumatic experience. I actually had a similar experience, but in the Navy where yeah, I could talk about that all day. I have a couple of these experiences. And if you're a person of color, you can relate to that, and you can relate to having those experiences on a regular basis. They're like pinpricks that happen all the time. So thank you for sharing that. And that was from Chris. And then I have, and it looks like CM, growing up in the rougher parts of California and Arizona, I have felt and seen privilege all of my life. Also growing up as an undocumented person, I see a lot of privilege, yes. And certainly that aspect of racism, we see in the news every day, and it grows deeper every day. When we do our historical analysis, we just talk about the different ways that people from other countries are treated based on the skin color and the origin of that country. So there's a difference between how you see migrants at the border of Mexico treated versus migrants that may come from European countries. And it's just a reality, and that's how our world is navigating right now. Maite, I wonder.
I was just gonna add one thing as you were speaking about how people might be treated that are from other countries or have immigrated or have been here for a long time. Another example of privilege in this discussion is language privilege. So as a Latina identifying woman, there is privilege that I carry as a person who was born in the United States and learned English sort of first, and then I learned Spanish because I was lucky enough to be in a Spanish speaking country for a little while in my childhood. And so some of the privilege that I carry has to do with my ability to speak English and what that sounds like. And yet, again, coming back to something that we've all been sharing so far, and we thank you again for sharing your personal experiences. And yet there have been situations where someone might be making an assumption based on how I look about whether or not I speak English, right? And so again, that's just giving you all another example of how the privilege might show up and how the inequitable treatment and how the racist treatment might show up because of that privilege. And then I don't know if you want to keep going, Donald, with the chat. Go ahead.
There was a couple more pieces of the chat, and this is an interesting one that is another part of the discussion that we don't have in this training, but it's really important. As Al says, as a child growing up in a biracial household, an example would be going to the store with my mother versus my father. The treatments and interactions showed the various outcomes depending on if you appeared white or Hispanic, where we ignored or asked if we needed help, et cetera. And that's a very interesting concept, because in biracial communities and biracial marriages and biracial relationships, sometimes privilege is taken away by your association with that marginalized group. And so it's a very interesting phenomenon that even people that are in the supremacy culture can lose that by associating themselves with people in marginalized communities, and are treated differently because of that.
That's right. And then one last thing to highlight, again, thank you so much for participating in the chat like you all are. Donna said, I discovered at the time how the notion of privilege could be fluid. Growing up with a sister who experienced cerebral palsy was how I first learned about privilege. And what I want to highlight in what you said, Donna, and again, thank you for sharing, is fluidity. And so the other thing that I think happens, whether it's experiencing inequities or again, benefiting from privilege, is dependent on the context. So you could have privilege in one space and not have it in another. And again, connected to what Donald just said, you might have privilege if you are a white person in a biracial relationship. That privilege will carry over if you are in white spaces, but if you go into biracial spaces or other spaces, that privilege might leave, right? So I think, again, an example of what the fluidity might look like. So let me see if I can get you all back to the presentation. Thank you again so much for your
really excellent comments, and we thank you all for participating.
Can you see
so
the screen? I think you can. Go ahead.
Yes, and so the next part of today's discussion is about detour spotting, and we have talked a little bit about detour spotting. A lot of what we'll be talking about today comes from a detour spotting presentation book study by Jonah Olson, who really took a hard look at, she was looking at privilege, women and men, and actually started down this road of looking at detours when it comes to conversations. And we know, again, that these conversations are tough, and it's easy to kind of move into sort of a defensive posture. And we've heard these many, many times. And here's just a few examples of detour spotting for white anti-racists. Again, that's Jonah Olson. I encourage people to read this. It really goes into these different examples of detours in a very comprehensive way. Color blindness is one we see all the time when people say that they don't see color anymore. And this is, I think there's a lot of theory that kind of this movement towards a colorblind society really stifled the growth when it comes to racial equity and racial conversations. When you don't see color, or say you don't see color, it basically erases the lived experience of that person of color. So it also indicates an unwillingness to acknowledge that you have privilege as a white person. So when you kind of use that concept of color blindness, it both doesn't allow you to see our unique experiences and differences, and it also doesn't allow you to see how you're able to navigate the world a lot more easily. Another one is innocence by association. And we just talked about that. And you'll hear this from people that are in relationships or working in communities of color, that they do not, they can stop the conversation in its tracks by saying, well, wait a minute, I have a friend who's Black, or I'm married to a Black person, or I'm married to an Asian or Hispanic person. You'll hear that all the time. And people will stop a conversation about race by interjecting that innocence by association. Reverse racism is another one, and we hear this all the time. And people say that BIPOC people can be racist, and it is true that people of color can be just as prejudiced as anybody else. That every human being in this world has biases and may lean towards another race, and again, does have prejudice, but individual prejudice does not come attached with that very important element that we talked about. You can be as prejudiced as you want, but if you don't have power, that does not become racism or any of the other isms again. So power is what gives you the ability to have, to become racist and participate in systemic racism or institutional racism. It's the power that defines whether or not it's racism. So again, you can have individual prejudice, but racism is something very different, and it's defined by having the power to impact the lives in a positive way for your race, and in a negative way for another race. So power is the defining part of that. And yes,
one thing to that, Donald.
Sure, absolutely.
One thing that comes to mind again when we're talking about power and why that is different, or racism versus prejudice, as Donald was explaining, is that you have to think about, for example, if you're working in an organization and you're thinking about policies, asking yourselves the question about who created these policies and for whom, or who were the authors of said laws, right? And so the point being made here is the power that white groups of people, white people have had historically, has created the laws, has created the rules, has created policies that have perpetuated inequities, right? And so therein again lies the difference between individual prejudice or group prejudice versus racism, and the power that is inherent in that, and rather than just the prejudice. So I just wanted to give that example.
Thank you very much. And I won't go through all of these, but some of the other ones are yes, but what about me? And we kind of just went over that. We understand the challenges and barriers everyone faces, but again, it is not an issue of your color unless you're a person of color. You don't have those challenges as a white person if you are white and part of the dominant culture. I'm sorry, got stuck there for a minute. There's also the myth of meritocracy and blaming the victim. There are ways to, like that example in the video about the preschool age children. We all start off in the same place. We're not born racist, we're taught racism. And so, the idea that kids of color would be that more in need of punishment is kind of beyond the pale of belief. Others, like if you explain away some things because everyone is kind of has the same options in life, it goes back to what Maite also said about we have no control over where we're born. We know that school systems aren't equal, that if we live in red line communities, we don't have hospitals and vegetables and learning environments that are those that would allow us to achieve. And the one that gets me the most that you can't explain away, and there was just a recent study in Los Angeles that looked at infant mortality rates. And the infant mortality rate for an African-American woman with an advanced degree is the same as a white woman with less than a 7th grade education. So you have to take away all those other excuses. It's education, it's privilege, it's money, it's prenatal care. So there's something wrong with the system that is creating that disparity. And so again, you might be able to come up with some excuses that you find plausible about some of those things, but there are many that you just can't explain away any kind of way. The other one I just want to highlight before we move on is silence. And silence, when we don't speak out, and there was a woman in the video that talked about this, when you're with your friends or you're in the company of your family at the Thanksgiving dinner, and you hear people disparaging other races, or you hear people doing racist jokes, if you want to be an anti-racist, and again, that's a desire that you have to have. If that's who you want to be in this world, then you have to say something. Silence is giving people the authority, the right to continue down that, and you're complacent in it if you don't interrupt it and rise up and say something about it. We could also talk about, and we'll talk about this a little later. Many of you talk about when you started to learn about privilege, when you started to learn about race as a social construct. Now we have an effort underway, and we'll talk about this a little bit, where there's a desire to whitewash history, to basically erase the true history of this country so that young people don't have the ability to understand some of the horrible things that were done and how we got to where we are in our country, in our world. And it's really unfortunate that that's happening, but that is a really big detour. And so I'll stop there. I think that we've gone to detours a lot. We also wanted to talk about kind of one of the major detours that we see happening right now. And a lot of people are faced with kind of the reality of listening to this in your local school district or even in university settings at this point. And it's a hard concept to understand or explain. So we want to give you some ammunition when you have those conversations. And so we wanted to bring into the discussion as we dig into detours. This may be the biggest detour that we have in our current discourse around race, and that's the idea of critical race theory. And so we want to share with you a video that we think kind of explains it in a deeper way.
The whole purpose of critical race theory is to provide Americans with a way to understand the legacy of racism, even though those stories sometimes hurt.
It's anti-American training that vilifies white people and demands they apologize.
The best learning for students about social studies and about our democracy and our country is the learning where students can really grapple with the issues and really come to a deeper understanding of how our past informs our present.
All of this revisionist, woke curriculum, you are not going to do this to our children.
Teachers
teachers across the country are caught in the middle of the latest flashpoint in America's culture war, critical race theory. So what exactly is it? And why is there a push to ban it in schools?
Critical race theory is a body of ideas and a set of approaches to understanding the history and the present of American society that looks at the ways in which racial unfairness have been woven into the fabric of our institutions.
In other words, critical race theory, or CRT for short, is a legal academic framework centered on the idea that racism is systemic. It first started to coalesce in the 1970s when Black, Hispanic, and Asian legal scholars were researching the persistence of inequality despite the landmark legal victories of the civil rights era.
The legal scholars undertook a set of analyses and investigations that were aimed at trying to make sense of the puzzling persistence of racism in our legal system, in our political system, in our economy.
CRT has been studied in fields like sociology, economics, and political science. It's been used to examine issues such as housing and educational segregation, unconscious bias, and criminal justice reform.
Contrary to what often critics portray as sort of judging people intrinsically as being racist or not, or holding people responsible for, slavery in the past, it is actually to open up a conversation of how we all inherit and live in a society sort of beyond our choosing. Right? We didn't choose where we were born or what racial group we were part of, and yet we have this common history. How do we understand that history? What does it mean for us? Those are the sorts of questions that critical race theorists were trying to grapple with.
The racial reckoning spurred by the police killing of George Floyd brought the decades-old framework back into the spotlight as some schools sought to implement reforms that better address race in classrooms.
I think the thing that critical race theory would add to that conversation is that we not sort of confine that horrific example to Derek Chauvin, but to think about how, well, there were other law enforcement officers present, including officers of color, who stood idly by. And so that pushes us to think about, this phenomenon as not simply one of, racism by whites against Blacks, right? I mean, it makes us think more critically, more engaged, more seriously around, well, why do these practices happen?
The push against CRT gained steam under former President Trump when he directed federal agencies to end any diversity trainings related to critical race theory. Though ultimately blocked on First Amendment grounds and rescinded by President Biden, the fight over CRT at the state level is still in full effect.
The focus on CRT is a way to latch onto a concept that very few people sort of really understand, which sounds kind of scary perhaps to someone not, trained in what it means, and latch onto that as a kind of football in this sort of ongoing fight over, the future of this country with regard to racism.
As of mid-June 2021, 21 states have introduced bills attempting to restrict the teaching of critical race theory and or impose limits on how race is discussed inside the classroom. And those limits are often vague.
And instructors, educators, especially at the K-12 level, will just not go there, not run the risk of upsetting parents or, being misunderstood or drawing the ire of, lawmakers.
In Texas, for instance, House Bill 3979 says teachers must explore current events from multiple positions without giving, quote, deference to any one perspective.
There's language in this bill, like teachers need to present a balanced perspective on current events, for instance. They have to do their due diligence to present multiple viewpoints. But what happens if they're talking about an issue in the classroom and they try to present multiple viewpoints, but the student comes home and tells their parent about the lesson that day, and the parent thinks, well, they didn't do a good enough job of presenting this viewpoint. So who decides when the teacher has done an adequate job of presenting multiple perspectives on an issue? It saddens me and disappoints me that instead of really embracing this opportunity to confront our nation's past and to tell authentic and more accurate
narratives about experiences of, diverse people in this country, that we're looking to sweep it under the rug. We're looking to erase it even further from our memories.
Thank you all for listening to that.
So we thought that important in our discussion about detours. It's actually even beyond the detour now. It's and all kinds of issues are going on in different state levels. And we see even the banning of some of the people some of the quotes you've seen today are banned in some communities. So Maite, I'll give you the chance to jump back in on CRT.
So what you see on your screen, hopefully everybody can see this again. I just reshared the slides so you can see it. So just to add a little bit more into what the video said. So critical race theory, again, they mentioned this a bit in the video. Since January 2021, 44 states have introduced bills that would restrict CRT or how teachers can discuss racism and sexism. 18 states have imposed these bans, legislation, or other means. The pushback is grounded in white comfort and the belief that structural racism isn't real. And actually, I just want to pause here and say again, white comfort, which is still coming from white privilege, and also white comfort or avoiding white discomfort is an example of white fragility. And then you have opponents do not want any diversity, equity, and inclusion in their curricula or teacher training. And the concern is that it will make, again, quote, white children feel uncomfortable and or guilty. And then the last piece of this is, according to the Heritage Foundation, critical race theory makes suspect legal approaches such as neutrality, colorblindness, and meritocracy. Again, which is in essence trying to erase what we know to be true. Donald, I don't know if you want to add anything else to this.
So there is a lot of theories about why this has been a course of action and really introduced in the community. One of the founders and kind of the inventors of this particular theory, who also really coined the term intersectionality, talking about the different kinds of isms, ableism and sexism and some of the other isms. She talked about this from the same perspective as Michelle Alexander, who talks about the new Jim Crow. So what they believe is that the march towards making critical race theory and the teaching of African-American history and the other histories in our country, the reason it's being done is a new backlash. And that backlash was a result of the integrated activities of the Black Lives Matter movement. So when you look at pictures of Black Lives Matter, what you'll see is people of all races coming together. And so if you remember when we start talking about this and the need to divide, and we talked about that at the very beginnings of the invention of race in our country and the introduction of race. We talked about the Bacon Rebellion. So in order to keep people from coming together to fight against oppression, there is a need to disrupt it and interrupt it. And so critical race theory is a response to the marches that had Black people, white people, Asian people, Hispanic people all together saying, we will not stand for people to be killed continuously by law enforcement in our country. There was a need to interrupt that movement. And so that is a reason why we saw many of the things that happen in our school systems have nothing to do with critical race theory. This is actually a college course, an advanced college course for people with advanced degrees. This is never taught in an elementary school or a high school or even most colleges. And so it was used again as a label to be able to stop in its tracks a movement towards racial justice in this country. And throughout history, we've seen that. I'll give Maite the next part of this discussion.
Okay, so the other thing that we wanted, as you all can probably tell, we really like using quotes and books written by amazing people. And so what you see here is a quote from the book, How Good People Fight Bias, and sort of aiming to be the person you want to be, and something to echo something that Donald said earlier, sort of living in your values. And so if your value is to become or to be or to continue to be an anti-racist person, then what does that look like, right? Or what does it mean to be the best you or the you that you'd like to be? And so what you see in this quote is the following. We need grace to let in the idea that we may not be as perfect as we thought we were. Grace means everyone is at a different point in their journey. Grace means that we all make mistakes. I'm going to say the wrong thing, do the wrong thing. It's more important to take a risk and talk about racism and know you might screw up than to not talk about it at all, which, as Donald said earlier, again, one of the signals or one of the common detours is silence. And being able to be silent in the face of a racist joke, a racist moment, prejudiced moment is, again, a marker of privilege, because there is privilege in being able to remain silent. The other thing I wanted to say, actually connected to this, which you all might remember hearing in the video that we showed you about the conversations on race with white people, was there was a gentleman who was speaking who said, I don't know that I want to say much about race, and I'm paraphrasing here. I don't know that I want to say much because I don't think I'm going to sound wise. I wrote that in my notes because I've watched this video multiple times. And what I want to point out here again is basically saying, I don't want to sound unwise sounds to me like I don't want to sound like I don't know what I'm talking about, or I don't want to sound or say, like this quote says, I don't want to say the wrong thing. And I think what we're all trying to say here and the discussion around this is to accept that to be human is to be flawed. And B, to be human is also to be able to learn. And there is grace to be had for oneself in their process of learning. And there's grace to be shared with others as we learn together and as other people learn in front of us, basically, right? And so again, this is just asking, what does it mean then? Or what can we do now, knowing this information, and sort of accept that once you do this, once you, again, choose this value of being anti-racist in your behavior and what you support and how you show up in the world, what does that mean? And is it okay to make mistakes? And basically what we're saying to you is yes. So I don't know if I think we do have time to do one more question for you all. And the question here is, even though we're not able to put you in breakouts, again, we're going to ask you this question, and then we'd love to see what you have to say in the chat. And if you'd like to share it, please do. But the questions are, where have you witnessed detours? How did you respond? How do you wish you'd responded? Would you respond differently? So I'm going to stop sharing for 1 second again, if my computer allows it, which might not be the case. Let's see. There we go. So again, where have you seen detours? And did you respond, or how do you wish you had responded? So if anybody would like to share in the chat and or ask to speak up by raising your hand, that would be great.
And I would encourage people to read Jonah Olson's article. You can just Google it, and it'll show you about 50 of these 50 other detours that you might have run into. And we definitely often see that as we have these conversations.
Let's see.
So Megan has raised her hand.
Excellent. Let's see if we can give you access.
So are we able to let Megan speak?
Megan, if you want to raise your hand again, there are two of you, and I don't know which one. There you go.
Megan Lee.
Megan Lee, sorry.
There we go. If you'd like to unmute yourself, here you go.
There you go. Sorry, I was
No,
circling.
no.
I was just going to say the biggest thing I think that sticks out for me was I believe it would fall under the gaslighting around me a lot as growing up, that I believed opportunities were equal, and if you worked hard enough that you could get to those places. I love the homeless to Harvard concept I always use because I'm in homeless to homeless services. And so I think that would be the biggest one for me, is that there was this belief that was so false that if you worked hard enough, you could achieve anything in the world. And that's like, no, not if you start out of the gate not going to an equal school with equal education and equal opportunities and that type of stuff. So that one, I think, is that gaslighting? Am I right about that?
Yes.
John, do you want to go ahead? Yeah.
No, you go ahead. That is gaslighting. It's manipulating someone into an idea that is not factual by kind of saying something that you really know isn't true. We see this in politics all the time. So yes, that is an example of gaslighting. And it is, the meritocracy idea that, if you do the right thing, things are going to happen for you in this world, the same as they happen for others. And that's just not true. It's back to we're all a product of nature. We have no control over where we're born. So where you're born makes a lot of difference. Who you're born to makes a lot of difference. All the resources that are afforded to you because of where you're born really make a difference. I mean, if we just think about school systems, school systems are monetized based on your property value, the property taxes that you pay, and we know that those resources are not even in a inner city community in the same way that is in suburban communities, and the same thing for rural communities. So the idea that we all have the same chance is just not factual. But that is actually ingrained in us over and over again. If you make it from homeless to Harvard, you're just a very lucky person.
Yep. The only other thing that I would add to this conversation about gaslighting is, so from a psychological point of view, gaslighting is to be in a situation where you have shared an experience and a person is making you doubt your own reality. So if, for example, a person of color is sharing an experience, or a microaggression occurs where someone has said something, and let's say that I'm in that situation and I say to somebody in my midst, you know what, that made me uncomfortable and can we talk about this? I feel off about this. And if someone were to say, well, Maite, why is that a big deal? Like, that's no big deal. Or I didn't mean that. That is inherently making me question my own experience and my feeling, right? And so gaslighting is that. Gaslighting is, that didn't really happen. So just wanted to give you that example. And I realize it is 5:25. So I'm going to bring you back to the slides for one last moment and ask you all to participate in a little bit of reflection, which you've been doing great with so far. So thank you so much for that. Let's see if I can do this again. Show you my slideshow. Okay, so what you see in the screen in front of you now is the following. So we'd like you to integrate your learning. And so the question here for you all is, given the discussions that we've had, given what you knew before you walked into this discussion and all the reflections you've heard others share, what are you going to do next? So we're inviting you to have sort of a moment of silent reflection, maybe a little less than 3 minutes. But if you'd like to write down or think about your takeaways from this session, right? And there's a bonus here for focusing on, on action steps that you could take perhaps even later today, tomorrow, what have you. So an example of this for you might be, given everything that we've discussed today, I want to ... or I will take action by, again, ... or I need to talk to or engage with, and then list actual names either of people, if you'd like, or of organizations. So I am also going to put this in the chat for y'all, again, just to have it. And so this is, again, just an opportunity to reflect on what we've discussed today. And as you do that, we also wanted to highlight Dolores Huerta, who again is a champion in her own space as well. What she says is, every moment is an organizing opportunity. Every person a potential activist, every minute a chance to change the world. And so again, this is just a reminder of the agency that we all have as individuals and the impact that our behavior and how we show up in the world can have on our circles and in our organizations. And so we just want to make sure that you hear us say this very important piece of agency here. So I'm going to stop sharing in case anybody would like to share anything else in the chat. And while I get you all a survey link. And Donald, I don't know if you'd like to say more while I do that.
No, I think it's incredibly, that's such a powerful statement. And I know Dolores personally, really, really important that we think of it in that way, that we are creatures of this earth, and we have a chance in our generation to really interrupt racism and structural racism in a way that no other generation has had. So every one of us, and we talk about this in other trainings, has a sphere of influence. And it's so important that we activate that sphere of influence and start to become the change we want to see. So we hope that from some of what you got today, you'll be able to use that. We do have a survey of today's webinar, and hope that you'll both engage in the survey, and you'll see that in the chat. But we also hope that you will join us for the next 3 webinars. And I don't know, Kelly, if you or someone else from MAG would like to say anything before we leave. We'll also leave you with a number of resources, the many that we talked about today, detour spotting, unpacking the invisible knapsack, and the laws banning critical race theory. All are things we talked about today. And please take your time and become your own historian. And please take the opportunity to use some really amazing resources.
And Donald, I think, I don't know that whether this has been said or not, but this webinar has been recorded. I'm not sure how it's going to be shared, but it is being recorded. A. B, you should have access to these slides. And C, we can send you links to the videos that we used today if you'd like to watch them again, to discuss them, to use them in your circle, so that you have access to that as well.
And I know we only have a minute or so, but really a couple of really great comments about things that people will actively do. One is, the next time I'm gaslighted, I'll have a follow-up conversation, ensure we all leave with a win-win attitude. This will be an opportunity for personal reflection and a aha moment for all involved. And secondly, I want to have an open conversation with colleagues or friends as a white woman with privilege, how I can be an advocate and the type of support when situations occur. For example, at the grocery store with friends of color being asked if they need help or offered a checkout lane. So thank you. Those are really, really good examples. And your homework for tonight is to continue to think about, how you can be an interrupter of racism and being an anti-racist in your social circles. So we thank you so much for being here. I know that's a lot that we packed into an hour and a half, but we hope to continue down this line in the upcoming months. And please enjoy your weekend. And thank you so much for being here.
Thank you all. Take care.